My name is Kenneth Paul Tan, and I am a professor at the Hong Kong Baptist University School of Communication and Film. On behalf of the organizing committee, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this three-day conference on narrating Cold Wars, organized by the School of Communication and Film in collaboration with the Academy of Visual Arts and the Department of Government and International Studies. The historic Cold War may have ended around 3 decades ago, but its influence continues to weigh heavily on much of our imagination today. In one sense, the Cold War has been a highly generative source of creativity, invention, and optimism in the human ability to surpass our natural limitations. But in quite another sense, the Cold War continues to constrain our thinking and behavior, locking us into what seems like an eternally repetitive cycle of division, binarism, competition, othering, fear, conflict, and violence. The same tragic script, but different actors dressed in different costumes and occasionally improvising their lines. And in the end, it's the same old catharsis and self-congratulatory applause. In 2021, what should we make of this legacy? Is the Cold War an old specter that tenaciously haunts our world, begging to be exorcised and therefore liberated from our collective lack of imagination? If so, then we might want to think of these 3 days as an exorcism, a ritual of diverse liturgies to summon the ghosts of the Cold War so that we may set them and us free at last. Over the next 3 days, we will hear from 5 keynote lecturers, 7 roundtable speakers, and more than 60 paper presenters. They come from all over the world and work in multiple disciplines and interdisciplines, signaling how pervasive Cold Wars have been in global scholarship. They will tell us what they think is old and what is new in the seismic geopolitical shifts of power, wealth, and modes of communication and interaction that we are witnessing today, often with great trepidation. They will help us rethink what we think we know of our history, unraveling myths and elaborating on counterfactuals. They will demonstrate the porosity of divisions and categories that Cold War thinking has ossified, showing us examples of relentless boundary crossing, creative fluidity, collaboration, pluralities, and hybridity. They will point to the human and ecological traumas to which we irresistibly, nostalgically, and sometimes even hypocritically return to face our deepest fears, in sometimes barely recognizable forms. They will tell us about people who moved or were moved or could not move, and what such things as survival, freedom, identity, solidarity, dignity, and human flourishing could mean for them. But before we begin, I want to take this opportunity to thank my fellow organizing committee members, Cherian George, Mateja Kovacic, Daya Tusu, and Inju from the School of Communication and Film, and from Academy of Visual Arts, Noit Banai, and from the Department of Government and International Studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences, Jean-Pierre Copston, and Alistair Cole. I want to thank staff and students who have worked very, very hard to make this event a reality. This conference is organized with the generous support of the School of Communication and Film, as well as the university's research office. I therefore want sincerely to thank the Dean of the school, Professor Huang Yu, and the Vice President for Research and Development, Professor Guo Yike. And finally, let me warmly thank the speakers, chairs, and all participants for congregating with us in this way. And so now, let the exorcism begin. Sleep, yes. On the right. We go to.
Okay, there's a comment from someone online saying there's no sound.
So,
It's not fine.
Okay, someone else says they do have sound. Okay, so go ahead. Yes, I can hear it all right. Excellent. Okay. So those who hear things outnumber those who can't. I'm very sorry for those who can't. We'll continue.
it's the ghost.
I have sound problems too.
The spectre.
Okay, no, okay. So very few don't have sound. So let's soldier on. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My colleague Kenneth Poltan gave you a brief introduction to why this this event is both so ambitious as well as approached with such humility, where we are attempting the extremely ambitious task of straddling, bewildering number of decades. And in this opening panel, we also have a bewildering number of locations that we are going to. Our speakers straddle too many time zones to even grasp. And I'm very grateful to them for opening our event with this panel, The Old and the New. I will introduce them before they speak rather than all at the start. We're going to start with Greg Simmons from the Ural Federal University, Uppsala University, as well as Turiba University, who will talk to us about Cold War and international relations then and now. Greg, over to you.
Okay, fine. I'm unmuted. A bit early in the morning for me. It's 1 o'clock. So anyhow, okay, my talk on Cold War international relations, then and now. My main point is to frame this around the issue of branding. And branding is something which has always been around international relations, and especially if we look at how branding is used to frame and interpret these particular events, but not only events, but to frame them as processes and trends. We've mentioned the old Cold War. We have a new Cold War, but previously in history, we've had the Great Game, and the Great Game has also manifested itself in different variations, New Great Game and Great Games, the original one. So this is something which is being used, and it's used to interpret and project relationships and understandings of trends and processes which are occurring in international relations, quite often during periods of change or competition between powers. And what we have now, if we look at old Cold War and the more recent new Cold War, this is no difference. But there are a number of significant differences if we start to break it down. And so this use of branding, it's a means to use rhetorical tools as well. It's a means of logic, logos, in order to interpret and to understand, although from a very specific way, but it's also ethos that is assigning different powers and different actors with different roles within this framed or narrated event. So if we look at the old Cold War, which began in the wake of the Second World War and lasted until 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was a binary, bipolar world where you had two roughly equivalent strength powers competing for influence and on a global scale. And if we look at it, it is showing these relationships, but it's also not only a matter of interpretation, but it's also a matter of judgment. It's a matter of legitimacy for the West. This was something which was seen in 1991 as a victory, because the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc signified that victory, and hence we had a rather triumphant call at the end of it, such as the end of history, this presumption that history is going to end with the domination of the West in terms of capitalism and liberal democracy. And if we look at that, then you've got this presumptive element within it. So if we look at 1991, this was a watershed because this then saw the end of what was the old Cold War and the beginning of what we have come to term in the geopolitical context as the rise of a Western-centric US unipolar global order. And this has been something which has been underpinned by different geopolitical interpretations about how to keep it this way, to keep this dominance, expand the influence. And I mentioned in my abstract the role of Brzezinski and his ideas of strategic imperatives of the US in his grand chessboard. That is to keep those allied states of the US dependent, to keep control of those global institutions, and also to prevent the rise of any power or group of powers that can challenge the US. And if we look at what has happened, one of the problems for the US in this regard was its understanding of the victory, because then the assumption was that hard power is unchallenged and it cannot be challenged. And this led to a number of different miscalculations and missteps, because hard power was seen as something which could be exercised without any consequences or results. And so we have what is in the beginning of the 21st century, the rise of the global war on terrorism, and what have come to be called as the endless wars, which have in fact had a detrimental effect on US global power, and been one of the means with which the US has reached a certain imperial overreach. And this has limited its ability to be an effective unipolar power. And looking at what is happening currently and why, because there is a reason why we have the rise of a new Cold War. Because this new Cold War, it's an informational program which is intended to complement, to assist the foreign and security policy program. So it does have a purpose. So looking at the rise now, which has even writers such as Nixon and Cooley and others who are acknowledging more and more the relative decline of the US Western-centric unipolar order and the rise of a non-Western-centric multipolar order. So what does that mean? It means that the US has been unable to carry out effectively those strategic imperatives identified by Brzezinski. And so what we have now, this new Cold War, is a means to try and frame, but also interpret and constrain how this changing global order is seen and interpreted, but also how people respond to it, especially considering that the legitimacy of Western governments is in a strained crisis-like situation owing to different problems of globalization and multiculturalism, and none more so than what we see in the current context of this coronavirus pandemic. But this idea of a new Cold War was starting to be generated already, some would say, by the Georgian-Russian War of 2008, when you had increased competition between Russia and the West. However, if we also look that this new Cold War is fundamentally different from the old Cold War, because instead of being a binary bipolar global order, this is a completely different configuration of global power and the distribution of influence and power. And this is seen within the frames within this new Cold War, because although the focus began with Russia, it has also shifted to China. And this was seen, for example, in Obama's Asia pivot. And so this was a Cold War which has expanded to include the globe, but in a much more complex manner. And so what this new Cold War is, in effect, it's a means to create what I would term as an orthodoxy of knowledge. That is, to create a consensus. And so this is using the information domain as a means to influence the cognitive domain. That there is an extraordinary situation, because when an extraordinary situation occurs, the old rules of the game, that is those international laws and conventions of doing things, are less applicable than when there is an ordinary situation. So this is seen or projected as being a threat, an existential threat to these values and norms such as democracy, the Western way of life, and other particular aspects like this. Now, looking at this, it's rather vague and coming into, okay, what is democracy in the current context? Because this is a problem in itself. It is a term which is highly open to interpretation, and therefore it is something which one can utter to a large audience and have multiple interpretations. And this is where this new Cold War as an idea is an attempt to create this idea that everyone should be mobilizing towards a certain goal. And as I say, I mean, this comes at a time when there's a declining level of trust between government and its citizens. And so this is a means to try and use the perceived legitimacy of the old Cold War and bring it through into the new Cold War. And so the new Cold War is also a means of obstructive foreign policy. That is a means to where foreign policy is used to try and limit or reduce the operational choices and opportunities for those that are defined as being the other to the Western-centric order by limiting their options and increasing the operational choices of those Western countries. And so you've got these notions such as these navigational rite of passage and so forth, but also these kinds of conflicts which have been seen within this R2P and humanitarian warfare. So if we look at where this new Cold War is going, it is trying to, as I say, reduce the rise of these non-Western centric powers as a means of still enabling a dominance of those Western centric powers. That is, that they do not have the same capacity and capability as before, but still to retain that advantage that there is no one single power or coalition of powers that can challenge. Although this is something which is failing in its own right, because if we look at the how this is evolving, this new Cold War, it has spread the US too thinly. And if we look at actual events on the ground, then this is telling a different story. For example, the US was the undisputed powerful broker in international conflicts. So for example, Syria, Afghanistan. But if we look currently, these are moving away from these Western-centric control to a non-Western-centric. So for example, the conference in Tehran recently concerning the future of Afghanistan. So this new Cold War as an idea has evolved as a means to try and win back the initiative by limiting the strengths and opportunities for competing powers. But the competing powers themselves are not playing the game completely, because they have the ability to challenge and are increasingly doing so within the context of international events. I mentioned Afghanistan and Syria, but also you've got South China Sea, Taiwan and others. But I think my time is up. So in order to keep everything going smoothly, I will finish here. So thank you.
Conference. I think this, your ideas that, the hard power dimensions of international conflict, including military and diplomatic dynamics, really can't be understood without reference to the mobilizing role of ideology and branding would be something that I guess would be a recurring theme over the next 3 days. So thanks for that extremely stimulating start. And audience members who have questions, please do make use of the Q&A function in Zoom. You can type in your questions and we'll come to them after all the speakers have had their say. We'll move on now to Arjun Chatterjee, who is a former journalist turned academic. He's had 16 years of experience in broadcast and digital media and research across Asia and Europe. He's a Chevening scholar at the University of Sussex in the UK and a news presenter from India. We are going to invite him to revisit the end of history thesis 30 years on.
Thank you, Professor Cherian, and thank you all my co-panelists and the audience. It's morning here in India. It's around 6 in the morning, 5:50. So good morning, everyone. I would just take a moment to share my screen. Thank you, Professor. My book was, so I started on with the end of history and the last man. And the abstract, the main topic of this paper was revisiting the end of history thesis 30 years on. Because it's an interdisciplinary international conference, I took the liberty to club it with somebody else. So in my initial slides, I would show you two social scientists, political scientists of immense repute. One is obviously Francis Fukuyama, who had written the book, 1989, the article in 1992, the book itself. And then I club it with Charles Tilly, who's another legendary American sociologist and political scientist. His period is between May 1929 and April 2008. So Fukuyama is around, say, 20, 23 years after Tilly was there, but they were working together. And I pick up two books. These are very interesting books in international relations and political, political history and political science. And this one is Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. And then the second one is Charles Tilly's book, which is Coercion, Capital, and European States. Why I do this is because as a Cherian scholar, I had studied conflict, security, and development at the University of Sussex. So I have this background of peace and conflict studies. And I would like to relate that with modern day warfare and how states are formed. So I would gradually take you through, first I'll project and talk about these two books and see where these theses are actually leading to, whether they still hold on to it or whether there's a postponement of it. So Fukuyama, in his 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, in a sense, he talks about warfare in the post-Cold War is unlikely, given the rise of democracy and interdependence. And 30 years on, Fukuyama himself writes about reorientation of the political axis from economics to identity politics. Now, I did not have, I just had to read the books, obviously, but Fukuyama himself, and that's the beauty of political science, that the entire body of knowledge keeps evolving. And in the 30 years, Fukuyama himself had figured out that what he was being extremely lucky about when he was writing in 1989, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, about liberal democracy, that has somewhere taken a back seat. We will come to that in a moment. But before that, I would also take you to Charles Tilly's book, which is a 1990 book. It has a second edition, slightly with minor modifications, which and came out in 1992 then. It's called Coercion, Capital, and the European States. It particularly talks about war making and state making in the European context. And in the book, Tilly argues that war is a fundamental strategy of state making, and that states and state agents are often the primary perpetrators of violence. Now, Tilly traces the interaction between war and state making and the origins of nation state. And in this paper, we will also try and have a close look at the difference and the intersections of civilization states and nation states. So Fukuyama's focus, coming back to Fukuyama's end of history thesis, he defines liberal democracy in three separate institutions. And he says one of them is modern state, a state that is capable of actually delivering services and protecting the country, both internally and externally. The second is something he talks about, the rule of law. And I think, yeah. So second is, he talks about the rule of law. And the third is obviously when he mentions about the democratic institutions. And we will see how they are performing in the present global context in different countries. It's very interesting. While doing this research on Fukuyama, I had read this book long back, but I had not the book that is there on the screens after the end of history. And this is a 2021 Georgetown University Press publication. It's an interview with another social scientist, Matilda Fasting. She was interviewing Fukuyama. And here Fukuyama points out himself the problems of the liberal democracy that he had theorized way back in 1992 in his book. And the most striking here is that he says that democracy is easy, but it's very difficult to have the modern state impersonal. And he says what is incredibly common all over the world are that the states that deliver service are delivering it only to a certain section of the people, a community, a tribe, who are supporters of a particular political leader. We have seen that in very recent elections all over the world, mostly in several countries. You look at Europe, you look at the US, pre-Biden, Trump era. And then Fukuyama says that the state is full of patronage and corruption, which at times gets very grotesque. And it's often captured by military gangs. You look at some of the state structures within the African continent, sometimes by families or by people, and the state ceases to function. Therefore, the modern state is fragile. And here it's a quote. He says it's a miracle and it is fragile. And he writes, the major arguments concern not the principles of liberal society, but the precise point at which the proper trade-off between liberty and equality should come. I mean, here one should be reminded of the great English philosopher John Stuart Mill, who had argued that there is an inherent controversy in liberalism between freedom and equality. So very recently in the Journal of Democracy in January 2020, Fukuyama writes this article, 30 Years of World Politics, which is my next slide. What has changed? And he clearly points out these key points and the reorientation of the political axis from economics to identity, a technology shift from being democratic to becoming Big Brother. And here he talks about by Big Brother, the big tech companies, the Apple, the Facebook, the Twitter, AI, big data, and all of that. A loss of status for mediating institutions and the press, the media. I live in a country, I live in India, and as a journalist, it's pretty shameful to say that out of the 197 countries, the press freedom index, I think, is 142 at the moment. We know what the press, the international media is going through in different parts of the world. I know where this international conference is being hosted in Hong Kong, the press scenario is. We don't need to elaborate on that, but it's understandable that there is a loss of status of mediating institutions and the press. There is a decline in trust. There are consequences of neoliberalism. And Fukuyama, by that, argues that although it has brought millions of people out of poverty, it has also created income equality. And that has led to a sort of a destabilization. And then he talks about the ramifications of US policy mistakes. I will keep oscillating between these two books for a while, and then I move on to Charles Tilley's book, sorry, where Coercion, Capital, and European States, where Tilley argues, and this is a famous quote of Charles Tilley, a war made the state and state made the war. I, as a chiefly scholar, I had the privilege to travel to the Balkans and stay there and work there with some of the East European nations. I was there in Kosovo, in Pristina, and traveled a bit to Serbia as well. And while conducting that research, it was evident, that was my final thesis, where, what Tilley was saying was probably true to an extent for the making of the European states, but probably doesn't hold on. So Tilly argues war wove the European network of national states, and preparation for war created internal structures of the state within it. I mean, it's a long book. It gets very difficult to talk about in 15 minutes, but I'll try my best. War makes states argument that finds validity in the great scholarship of Weber and Hinge. Tilly argued that the central processes helped build a positive relationship between war making and state making. Now that's a point that has to be argued. And according to Tilly, the pursuit of war and military capacity led to civilianization of government and domestic politics. I will ask the audience to think about civilianization, because we'll come to that at a later point in the presentation. Now, Tilly's evolutionary model of state forms are primarily three, and that is, so where we have capital and coercion, and then he starts linking them. So it's either capital intensive state form or it's coercion intensive state form. More recent ones are capital coercive state forms, which is a particular combination of both with a balanced level of both capital and compulsion. Accumulation happens. But after all of this, Tilly acknowledges the fact that this convergence, convergence is far from perfect, as even after convergence, states retain some features that reflected their earlier historical experiences. I am striking a point here that please start thinking about identity now at this point. So I will take you quickly through the Tilly's trajectories of European state formation, where he talks about a particular combination of capital and coercion, and the second factor of interplay of war waging on the international stage. I don't think that's a reality these days. And it happens similarly with Tilly again when you read the book that he writes in 2005 about identities, boundaries, and social ties. And if you follow Tilly's argument, and here I put in my point, which is the fourth point, that if war makes states, then the logical derivative will be that more wars will lead to more states. And that the pursuit of war and military capacity should lead to civilization of government, which is actually not the case in the 21st century. So where we are 30 years on, and these are two great American social scientists writing almost at the same time, two very scholarly work in the 1990s, and 30 years on, Fukuyama's end of history thesis meets a post-movement. He himself has written it in his later work. And I'm sure Louis Manin, I read his article sometime back, had written in the New Yorker that present trends don't continue. And I like his sentence: the identities that people embrace today are the identities their children will want to escape from tomorrow. Maybe. History in somersaults all the way to the end. What happens to Tilly's war make states? If you read the article in the scholarly work of Anna Leander, working in Geneva, I think, and she clearly states that if you take Tilly seriously, it helps us to understand why wars at present do not make states, but rather unravel them. That brings us to our next part of the presentation, which is, so what is the new currency? And here I quote a professor of London School of Economics, Christopher Hawker, who says in his recent book that culture is the new currency of power, and identity politics has characterized American elections. I mean, indeed it has, to push back against Western universalism in much of the non-Western world. I will quickly take you, I will not read the quotes, but before that, I will take you through two reports, Freedom House reports. And if you closely look at them, you see why I say Francis Fukuyama was lucky, because from 1972 to 2005, the graph of the democracy graph was upwards. From 35 countries in the world to around 115 countries became democratic. And from 2005, that's the graph. So there's a constant decline and 15 years of decline. The next infographic, unfortunately, I in India and the university in Hong Kong, we both feature in this graph potential high hopes on democracy and dashed hopes. I will not get into the further details of it. We all know why and how it's panning out. But optimism is the key to hold on. Now, when we talk about this, we cannot leave politics and political leaders, and that's a problem, whether you like them or not, but you cannot avoid them because they're much of the guiding force. And we have to start one by one. We take you quickly. Russia's President Putin, June 2019, says liberalism has become obsolete. And he says liberals cannot simply dictate anything to anyone, and every crime must have its punishment. I move on to the next slide quickly, and French President Macron, he says challenge of Africa in civilization. I think this is July 2017, Hamburg G20 summit. And look at where his comments are traveling to. He says in Africa, the essential challenges of Africa is that some countries today have 7 or 8 children born to each woman. I mean, what are you talking about? Then you have Hungary's strongman, Prime Minister Orbán, criticizing the EU. I particularly picked up 2 quotes, one in March 2012, after his first term elections, 2010, I guess. And the second one is very recent, this year, on the transgender issue in Hungary. But look at the first quote. He says in 1848, we said that we should tear down the walls of feudalism, and we were proven right. 1956, we said we have to crack down on communism, we were proven right. And then he says, we said we have to break out of the prison of debt, and we also declared that Europe can only be made great again. You find similar resonance, right, from Trump. With the help of strong nations, you will see, my dear friends, that will be proven right yet again. So there is a pattern in these statements. Move on to my Prime Minister in India. I picked up 2 quotes from 2014. Of late, he hasn't made much on the NRC, National Registration thing, any quote. But these quotes, February 2014 was before he became the Prime Minister, and September 2014 was just after he became the Prime Minister for the first time in India. If you look at the February 2014 quote, he says, we have a responsibility toward Hindus who are harassed and suffer in other countries. Where will they go? So India becomes a shelter for Hindus in neighboring states. That's what he's trying to say. In September 2014, there is a shift. And he talks about identity here. India does not need to become anything else. India must become only India. In Hindi, they call it Sone ki Chiriya, and that's why it's golden bird. And then we can't leave Xi Jinping. He talks about the Great Wall of Steel. Just before this conference began, I'm sure everyone is aware of the fact that there has been a surprise joint statement in the climate COP26, where China and the US have agreed to jointly work to reduce carbon emission. So that's significant. My presentation, which is the postponement of end of history thesis, brings up, poses these questions to all of you. Is identity politics guiding reconfiguration of international politics? Are civilization states such as China and Russia telling the Western civilization to value pluralism? Is history moving from rules of a system to values of several systems? Isn't modern warfare more about technology and sustainable innovations than any military might? Can democracy and safe autocracy coexist? And can civilization states and nation states have mutual respect among themselves to ensure development? I want to point out that while preparing the slides, I also got a bit lucky because China and the US, the joint statement that they have produced, Xi Jinping had conveyed to President Biden that China and US can work provided mutual respect is guaranteed. So what this paper proposes is, as political cultures and economic models continue to clash between and among civilization states and nation states, can civilianization become the potential common denominator for human development? I say this particularly because we need more of participation from the people than only politicians and governments. And I say this because of this fantastic speech that came up in COP26 by British naturalist David Attenborough. I'm not going to read it out. If you please find time, have a listen in of the 7-minute speech of the COP26. It gave me goosebumps. But what he very importantly says that is nature is a very key ally. And no nation, no state in the world has advanced to the point that they're sustainable. So if the world doesn't exist, no world order will exist. And here I try and wrap up my presentation to say civilizations have identified human wrongs. Probably civilianization should be able to identify the human rights. I have to wrap it up as the chair says.
Thank you.
So
thank you so much. Thanks very much, Arjun. Some of us in the room are old enough to remember the publication of the end of history like it was yesterday, but it is extremely useful for you to recap both Fukuyama's and Tilley's work in a very nuanced way. So thank you for that. My favorite quote from COP26 is, of course, blah, 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 right? But which I'm sure we will have none of in this session. I especially liked the way you ended, Arjun, because it segues very nicely to our next speaker, because you've reminded us that these dynamics have a lot more than more to do than simply intergovernmental relations. And our next speaker, Dr. John Wei, who's a lecturer in sociology and media at the University of Otago, operates in that non-governmental space, I guess. He's the author of Queer Chinese Cultures and Mobilities, published last year from Chicago University Press and Hong Kong University Press. John, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see the slides. Can you see the slides?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the chair and thank you for the two panelists who have presented before me on the issue of the legitimacy of the Cold War narrative and the new Cold War narrative as well, 30 years after the so-called the end of history. And today the topic, the title of my talk, my presentation, is about the new Cold War, about geopolitics, COVID-19, and the so-called grand strategies in great power rivalry. So that's the title of my talk. And the background would include both the current ongoing geopolitical tensions and superpower competitions between China and the United States, as well as the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the post-COVID socio-economic recovery and revival as well. So I also look at other things like the shifting regional and global manufacturing and supply chains under the influence of both the geopolitical tension, the new Cold War, so to speak, as well as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So my argument is basically to shift the grand narrative, the so-called grand narrative of the new Cold War, as well as the grand strategies in international competitions and international relations, including the trade war, the tech war, the decoupling, from China, the reshoring of manufacturing, and so on and so forth. So I want to reshift and recast all these grand narratives and grand strategies in the new Cold War to the focus on the lived experience of everyday people, of everyday life, the so-called micro social economics, that kind of narrative of especially marginalized populations. And I'm going to use a few case studies like in the Chinese mainland, in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan to analyze and interrogate the impact of this so-called new Cold War, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, the role the pandemic has played together, with the ongoing geopolitical rivalry, so to speak. So that's basically the topic that I want to share today. And that's my responsibility and my approach as a sociologist, basically. And just quick clarification that I'm actually a lecturer in sociology and gender studies. And I did my PhD in film and media and communication. So that's why I'm all kind of, coming into this conference from a more kind of interdisciplinary background or, approach, if you like. Okay, so we can start from here. So in this paper, I'm going to consider the current geopolitics and COVID-19 pandemic to cast a very critical light on the new Cold War, the so-called new Cold War between China and the United States, which is ongoing and widely and much debated as well, whether we can use the term, the concept of the new Cold War to describe the current ongoing geopolitical rivalry and tensions between the two major powers or superpowers, a bipolar kind of new order of the international relations, if you like. And I'm going to focus on 3 case studies from the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, as I just mentioned, to look at the impact of the pandemic and also the geopolitical conflicts on marginalized populations to recast these grand strategies or grand narratives of new Cold War in the current great power rivalry. And these marginalized populations may include rural to urban migrants, factory and service workers, as well as those with compromised immune systems whose life and livelihood have been put on the line by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as by the shifting manufacturing and supply chains in our post-COVID economic restructuring, decoupling, and reshoring, so to speak. And in so doing, this paper will consider the ongoing socio-economic and geopolitical shifts through the lived experiences of people to reconstruct the narrative of the new Cold War to better understand the impact of these structural global changes on people's life and on people's livelihood in current and future geopolitical rivalry, post-pandemic social revival, and economic recovery. In the past few years, we know that there's an escalation of geopolitical conflicts and tensions between China and the US. The COVID-19 pandemic has also been weaponized by both sides during the ongoing global public health crisis, where the once-in-a-century pandemic was caused by a virus that originated from China and was blamed on China's early mistakes in containing the outbreak of COVID-19. And since 2020, the dispute and hostility between China and the US have reached a new level, marking the start of this so-called new Cold War and the new age of a bipolar superpower global competition that the two countries compete and clash with each other on multiple fronts across trade, security, technology, the pandemic, as well as other geopolitical issues around, for instance, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Well, China is already the second largest economy and set to overtake the US by as early as 2028. Its GDP per capita, both nominal and in purchasing power parity, is only a fraction of that of the US. And China's rich and prosperous urban sector often overshadows its rural population and rural to urban migrants with less human capital investment, with the shift of the manufacturing and supply chains away from China due to the rising labor cost since the mid-2010s has put many migrant workers out of job. So that's basically going to be the first case study I'm going to consider today as a mini critique to consider the impact of the pandemic and the geopolitical tensions. So this kind of ongoing rural and urban divide in China, for example, together with a rapidly aging population and the sluggish fertility rate shown in China's latest census released in May 2021, has been widely recognized as major threats to China's ongoing and continued economic development and geopolitical ambition. And these urgent issues facing many internal and border-crossing migrants in China and also surrounding areas have been laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic and the changing global geopolitics, which have and will continue to disrupt and shift existing supply chains as well as modes of production and migration. Here I offer 3 case studies as mini critiques, as you can see on my slide, to examine the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing geopolitical shifts on marginalized populations through the mobility and immobility of people, of goods, of capital, to shed further light on the new Cold War narrative as the same part of the theme of this conference, of this gathering. And the first case study I want to offer here focuses on those with compromised immune systems. And in this case, that's a group of people in Wuhan in China, the epicenter of the initial COVID-19 outbreak. And these people with compromised immune systems were mostly migrant workers who had HIV or AIDS infection. And they were locked down at home at the height of the initial outbreak of COVID-19 in early 2020, because the initial outbreak occurred around Chinese New Year, and many migrant workers, like internal migrant workers in China, returned to their hometown and was locked down in their hometown. So that posed a significant risk and issue that was potentially life-threatening for those people with compromised immune systems, such as those with HIV and AIDS infections. First, although the medication in China for those infected with HIV was subsidized by the state and mostly free for those infected with this virus. The distribution was based on where a person first received a diagnosis and entered the public health system. As hundreds of millions of Chinese people, as we know, work and study in other parts of the country outside their hometown for better economic opportunities, most people can only access subsidized medication in the place they normally reside. And as I mentioned just now, the initial peak outbreak of COVID-19 in China occurred around the Chinese New Year, where many people were back with their family and locked down in their hometown. Although the central government allowed people to access medicines locally, they must have their records and relevant paperwork transferred from the place of diagnosis to local public health services, which turns out to be extremely difficult as the latter was already inundated with COVID patients. Further, some people in the surrounding rural areas around Wuhan had to walk for more than 10 hours to the hospital in the central city to get their medication if they had HIV and AIDS infection. As a highly restrictive lockdown largely prohibited people from traveling by motor vehicles, they had to walk for many hours to get their essential medication. And on top of that, the strong stigma around HIV and AIDS and the taken for granted association between that infection and homosexuality had made most people reluctant to disclose their diagnosis to their family, which would also reveal their sexuality. And some of them actually put their lives in danger after they run out of medication, but were unwilling or unable to acquire more through social workers or public health services without raising questions from their families, relatives, and neighbors. So this case itself shows how public health crises like COVID-19 have impacted, for example, migrant workers and also other people with compromised immune systems who were locked down in their hometown during the initial outbreak of the pandemic, where disrupted mobilities and disrupted supply and distribution of essential medication had become life-threatening. So that's the first case I want to offer here as a mini critique of the impact of the pandemic on marginalized populations, for example. But that's not only the cause of their suffering, of their disadvantage, so to speak, because the ongoing and future distribution of COVID-19 vaccines is also deeply structured by socioeconomic factors that pose a major threat and challenge in a large country like China, as well as other middle-income and low-income countries in this case. So this is an important case when middle-income countries without robust social security systems, such as China, are now facing a large and upcoming aging population and a large and unsettled rural to urban migrant population. The situation may be worsened if global manufacturing and supply chains continued to shift away from China, as the US and other countries try to decouple from China and reshore manufacturing in the ongoing new Cold War, so to speak, compounding a process that was already underway before the pandemic due to the rising labor cost in China. So that's when the pandemic and the geopolitics have come together to structure and shape the lived experiences and the life and livelihood of marginalized people, in this case in mainland China. And I'm going to continue with the second case study, which is about the manufacturing sector in Hong Kong. And my second case study considers another marginalized population, namely those low-skilled service workers, for example, in Hong Kong, to consider the impact of the pandemic and geopolitical tensions. We know that both Hong Kong and Taiwan shifted a major portion of their manufacturing to mainland China in the early 1990s, as mainland China started to reform its economy. As I mentioned about, since the mid-2010s, labor costs started to rise in China, and many companies started to once again shift their factories out of China to other countries and other places in Southeast Asia. And this process is still ongoing and has been accelerated by the pandemic, and also when geopolitical tensions drive many Western countries to decouple from China, and many countries have realized through the pandemic that the so-called just-in-time deliveries and supply chains have made their manufacturing and their supply chains vulnerable, and they have to reshore some of the factories and manufacturing sectors back to their homeland. And in this case, Hong Kong, on the other hand, has changed forever already since 2020, We know that the new national security law means that the end of Hong Kong as we knew it before, although so far the city has largely retained its status as Asia's financial center in an economic sense. So nonetheless, in this second case study, we noticed that, in 2021 specifically, the Hong Kong government, has been thinking about how to revive the local economy and rebuild society after years of stagnation, pro-democracy protests, and the blow of the pandemic. And this year, Hong Kong is trying to bring back some factory jobs that left decades ago by subsidizing manufacturing to diversify its economy from the single focus or the major focus on the financial industry. Although currently manufacturing only accounts for about 1% of Hong Kong's GDP. And this is part of Hong Kong's ambition to revive the economy, to create jobs, and to increase social upward mobility, especially for young people. As previously, all the white-collar jobs, especially those led by the financial industry, were only or mainly reserved for those highly educated. And many others in the low-skilled service sectors, for example, have suffered a much larger impact from COVID-19 travel restrictions as travelers and tourists disappeared from the city. However, the reshoring, so to speak, of manufacturing may not really solve the problem for the public, for the general population, as what has been brought back is largely high technology or high-tech manufacturing that relies more on automation and less on human labor. That is to say, the shifting supply chain and the reshoring of factories may still attract the better educated, while many local and immigrant workers in low-wage service sectors will still be left behind, unless they can upskill through further training and education to acquire the skills for better paid jobs in the high-tech factories and manufacturing sectors. So that's the second case I want to use to highlight the complex ongoing kind of social revival and economic recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic, and also due to the geopolitical rivalry. And the last case, I know I have just run out of time, but I'll just quickly go through the last case here, the last case study about the issue in Taiwan. So I'll just still share this screen quickly here. But so basically I was looking at the semiconductor industry and the chip, microchip making or fabrication industry in Taiwan, which has become increasingly important in the current geopolitical kind of tensions and the trade wars and tech wars, for example. And the semiconductors or microchips are driving everything from electric vehicles to today's advanced computers and also mobile phones. So we know that there's one specific or particular company in Taiwan called TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, that basically holds the most advanced microchip fabrication or making technology that is way over or ahead of their main competitors. And that chip making industry itself has become the so-called Silicon Valley, or not really Silicon Valley, a Silicon Shield, protecting Taiwan from the ongoing geopolitical tensions between China and the United States, in case China, the communist China, made any military offensive, to recapture Taiwan, for example. So that's why I want to look at this sector. But also there's a major community outbreak of COVID-19 in Taiwan just a few months ago that only got better like in the past 2 or 3 months. So in that case, manufacturing workers were actually got infected by COVID-19 because they were not able to work from home. They had to come to the factories to complete the production, to work on the production. So once again, this is a case about factory workers, who are at more risk of this kind of, for example, a pandemic, during pandemic. But we don't have lots of, relative, focus, so to speak, on this marginalized population under the grand narratives of the trade war, the new Cold War, or even the tech war between China and the US, in which microchip fabrication or semiconductors would play a major role. So that's why I really want to reshape and recast these traditional grand narratives of national security, technology, great power competitions, and so on and so forth, to focus more on the marginalized populations or the disadvantaged or underprivileged populations who may be exposed to more risks under the ongoing pandemic, as well as the ongoing geopolitical tensions or rivalry in this case, before we can continue to consider the recovery of the economy and the revival of our society after the pandemic and amid the ongoing geopolitical rivalries or the so-called new Cold War between China and the US. So that's my presentation today. Thank you, and sorry I was a little bit over time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wei. That was a much needed reminder of the impact of these international dynamics on marginalized groups in East Asia. Our final speaker for this panel is Victor Nemchinov, who is a senior research analyst at the Department of Comparative Culturology, Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Nemchinov, over to you.
Good morning, dear colleagues. Pleasure to be with you. I have listened to the beginning of this wonderful endeavor of this conference, and I'm very much pleased that it takes place both in the School of Communication and Film as well as in Baptist University. That gives you a certain dimension of how to look at things beyond small achievements and small points that we all have to take into account. So let me just start by saying that truly human communication is not about signals that we send, is not about commodities we exchange, but it is about dialogues that reassess our common human dignity and welfare. And our welfare cannot be detached from the welfare of our environment. That means from our planet. So it seems to me that there are three levels at which we can discuss our problems and our issues. The first level that has been thoroughly tackled at the beginning of this session deals with international and geopolitical issues. It is dealing with globalism that has emerged after the end of World War II, nearly similarly with the Cold War emergence. So let us call this first level global level. There is a second level that I'm interested in dealing with, being located in Russia, being a Russian, and looking at the world, staying in between the West and the East. So that gives me a sort of a hermeneutic opportunity to look at things with three eyes. One is the eye of a European, another is the eye of an Oriental student, and the third one is the eye of a Russian scholar. Now, having said this, I think that we need to talk about the second level. And the second level is spiritual. For me, this is important because actually all things that we take from the communication are personalized. We as individuals, we have the beliefs. Sometimes they're connected to confessions, and they make a nexus between a personal identity, personal life cycle, and the vertical criteria. So we have two dimensions. One is horizontal, which is where time flows in a line, and sometimes in a circular line, but that is the thing that relates to chronos, the Greek word for the time. But there is another dimension of time, which is called kairos, and it goes vertically up to what people call heaven or the skies or cosmos. So the cosmic dimension is the second dimension, or I call it spiritual, because it encompasses, apart from confessional things, it encompasses the cultural heritage of humanity that had been accumulated and left to us and to posterity. And then comes the third level, which I would like to introduce for your attention, which I call planetary level. Why I introduce this thing? Because it is connected precisely with the ecological issues that challenge us and our lives today. Incidentally, the Cold War became possible when we understood and accumulated means of destruction to guarantee, mutually guaranteed destruction of life on the planet. Only after that, we started to negotiate on SALT, on reduction of arms, on some rules of the game, as has been put here before. Incidentally, the new generation of scholars may think that the Cold War that we are trying to narrate at this conference and have to narrate has been something solid. It was not. As early as, let us say, there are different dates that we can start with, but as early as 1958 with the second Taiwan crisis of Straits, when American Navy was introduced to interfere in the situation, and the Soviet politicians told to Mao that they will not interfere in this game. That was a sort of a situation that later led to French President de Gaulle withdraw from the military organization of NATO in 1966. So the Cold War as opposition between East and West, between the two blocs, was not entirely monolith. And that is important because in many cases, after the crisis, after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, then after the different things that precluded us from getting closer, we still got, after 1962 Cuban crisis, we got the red telephones. We got the instant communication between a White House and the Kremlin to prevent the global collapse in case of a nuclear war. So when these things were removed, life became a bit easier. And then came SALT and other treaties, ICBM Treaty of 1972. And finally, there came an anti-political thing, which Gorbachev had tried to introduce to the planetary dialogue. He started speaking about quitting Cold War mentalities and introducing the common European, common transnational home where we could live like good neighbors. This idea failed. It has not been accepted or even understood by the people who thought in zero-sum game mentalities. They won. Not the US power had won the Cold War, but in the Cold War, there were no winners because, you know, there are cases when the loser gets stronger after the end of the war, if you think in terms of the wars. So we are now coming to what is called narratives. And actually communication is about narrating history, narrating the events, and projecting them into the future. So how can we narrate these events? In narratology, we get things that are connected with actors and actants. The actants are the superpowers that play this, what they call the big games. But life is not a game. Even if the game is very big, even if the stakes are very high, life is something different. And the nature that we have polluted, the ocean that we have finally getting as our debris point, they are also parts, but for them, their natural life, the wildlife, is not a game at all. It is real life. And that will affect our life before the artificial intelligence will pick up things that we don't think about and think for us. So let me say that narrating Cold War has been the prevailing scream for the universal picture of the world throughout the half of the 20th century. And that the main attribute of the post-war order was a thought in terms of the Cold War mentalities. It also served as the predominant instrument of, so to say, rational communication, which in case truly is irrational in global politics, because there are things that are much more important than global politics. I hint at the planetary issues. So in planetary thinking, there are no borders. There are no nation states any longer. We transcend all these things. And the proof to that is that about 80 people can simultaneously talk and listen and think on equal basis with different views. So we transcend the borders. And that's the most important thing that we have achieved to the present moment. So how can we use this? How we will work with this? I think this one lesson that we can learn from narrating the Cold Wars is that zero-sum mentality is to be given up, because it leads to worsening the situation, but not to zero option. Because how can you guarantee that you get the zero? You have to overreact. And overreacting each side is making the situation worse and worse. So that is the tenet of this type of mentalities. Now, when this fails, when the common house fails at the end of the Cold War, when the Eastern Bloc has been dissolved, the Berlin Wall was allowed by Gorbachev to be dismantled. What he hoped for, being not a politician at that moment, but being a planetary citizen of the world, he stopped playing the games. He stopped shaking the arms and forcing others. He let them go, as well as he let the Soviet Union go and split into different nation states. So what he implied, he wanted to think planetary, not to political cuisine where the tensions are high, but think differently, think on a friendly, dialogical terms with each other. Unfortunately, this attempt to shift and get away from Cold War mentalities has not been picked up, but the option was there. You know, there were two military blocs. When one said that we are no longer willing to fight the other military bloc, what could be the option for those who were in the Western Bloc? To shift and run away to the opponent's bloc, like it happened? Or there was another option that we had, how we can change the Cold War mentalities, and that was the option of neutrality. After the Second World War, two countries opted themselves for neutrality. Austria in 1955, when Soviet soldiers went away from Austria on the condition that Austria will remain neutral. And Finland, that had also opted the option of neutrality, being the close neighbor of the Soviet Union. And you know, the closest neighbors are, like closest brothers, are the very dangerous friend for friends, so to say. Now, the period of detente, I think, is a very important thing to consider, how this monolith opposition of binary forces has been attempted to be cracked and reduced. So we will have, in the new Cold War, as you say, we will have to pass through the same problems of mental understanding, where we live on the planet. How can we deal with this planet? And we will have to come to the options of neutrality, I think. So let me just sum up by saying that in the 21st century, we have to abandon wars of memory. And that is, if war is the prerogative of the state, so each new state seeks its rationale in feelings that were hurt, and then they wage wars. We wage wars against monuments, against names, against our former identities. That is a silly game. Let us not try to make it a grand game. So what I would like to say in the end is that the planetary perspective is important, and looking at the narratives that we will construct from different angles, including emotional, sensual, visual things, including the things that narrate our own self, narrate our own ways in the world, and allow us to communicate in a more solid, more dialogical way by trying to understand others and trying to respect the understanding of the others and celebrate our planetary living here, not by still pushing the issues of globalism, but to try to go planetary across the borders, thinking commonly of the problems we face. So I will end up at this point, and whenever you have the questions, I would be happy to respond to all specifics. Thank you, and I wish you good new thinking.
Thank you so much, Victor. I loved how you pointed out that the Cold War, despite having very hard and sharp edges, was never really solid. I also like your reminder that even in the depths of the Cold War, there were counter discourses, counter narratives that we should be trying to resuscitate, which reminds me that actually before I read the Fukuyama's book, I'd actually read in 1987, I believe, Mikhail Gorbachev's book, Perestroika, and I actually found it extremely inspiring as a university student reading this, even though it was widely dismissed as just Soviet propaganda and so on. So that was something that resonated with me when you brought up his thinking. The audience may be still just warming up. It is, after all, only the first session. So I'm going to actually just pose all four of you a question that I think recognizes your bravery and and the favor that you've done by actually starting us off. And I want to give you the opportunity to perhaps set the agenda for the coming days. Because one thing that the four speakers have done, I think beyond our expectations, is showing just how many different ways there are to crack this large theme of narrating Cold Wars. Each of you have taken the question in very different directions. And I think if you have listened, if the audience has listened to all four speakers, you would understand why this conference, which started out as a 2-day conference in our heads, actually has become 3 days, each of which is taking 13 hours. Effectively, it's a 1-week conference compressed into 3 days, right? And you may think that this is kind of indulgent to spend so much time on one issue, but I think the four speakers together have done a magnificent job of showing us just how many different avenues there are to pursue. So I want to ask all four of you for your own wish list. What do you hope, and you're confined to just one big idea, what do you hope this conference in the coming hours will either answer or will explore? What do you hope to see on the agenda? Shall we go in the order in which you spoke? And I'll invite Greg to tell us what you hope to learn from this conference.
I would hope that, well, you mentioned it was mentioned in the opening, that it breaks out of this binary thinking, because when you start branding things as a Cold War and a new Cold War, I mean, what this is in essence doing is restricting how you think about things, how you interpret things, the relationships that come from this interpretation, constraints and restraints on the cognitive domain. And this is done through the informational domain. And where this conference can contribute to that is through the informational domain, forcing people to think beyond those formal brands and ways of traditional ways of expressing things, to break it out, because when you break out of those things, many more possibilities result from that. So this is my idea.
Thanks so much. Arjun?
Thank you for this interesting session. I was listening to all the fellow panelists as well. I would go on a different track and wish to think that this Cold War 2.0 is hypothetical. As Greg pointed out, let's not have the branding. I would rather want to see how climate plays an important role in policy making, and how big powers involve themselves and engage themselves in technology, in climate change issues, and then set a new world order, because the world is no more unipolar. Multilateralism is the key to it, but how that pans out, and how, because it's one planet and one planet has to thrive together. So it becomes very important for me to see in this conference, as it says, Narrating Cold Wars, how the scholars actually talk about participation of the world in policymaking. As I said, civilianization is very, very important in the sense that, free trade, rule of law, human rights, good governance, how these things are talked about, and beyond governance, how we can start thinking about common public good. I think that is what I'm trying to understand and look at.
John?
Yes, thank you. It's really good panel, and it's really good honor for me to be able to participate in this conversation. And my expectation, or one thing I would expect from this conference, I would like to say in this area of studies, would be more convergence of different approaches or different theories. For example, I mentioned in my talk about like the lived experience of marginalized people and social groups. And I definitely want to say, for example, for those of us who work in the so-called critical international relations, which has a more kind of humanistic, focus on the average people who have agency but may not have power in this kind of grand narrative or the grand shift of the major kind of international relations and geopolitical tensions. So I want to say that convergence between the lived experience of everyday people, or maybe the narratives in cinema, in the media, for example, and how they convert with, or how they intersect with these grand narratives of the Cold War, of the new of the new Cold War, so to speak. And the second convergence I really want to say is relevant to a question I think just popped out on Zoom from the Q&A session. I think someone asked about how we can go beyond the binary, the bipolar kind of focus on China and the United States. So I'm just thinking, in terms of convergence, we can, for example, in the current geopolitics of the new Cold War, so to speak, there's already the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, and India as kind of coalition, so to speak. And also there's more recently, there's the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, and the US, the kind of coalition, so to speak. So it's heightened kind of geopolitical tension again. But on either side, there's more complicated in single country of China and a single country of United States working, competing against each other. There are definitely other kind of relevant geographical kind of areas, other countries, economies, and middle powers and small powers that we can take into consideration. And even about, for example, Hong Kong or about Taiwan, are relatively small powers and small economies, so to speak. So that can be part, they have their own part to play this kind of binary or bipolar kind of competition as well. So that's the second convergence I want to say, to bring together different kind of actors, so to speak, in this big picture, so we can have a better understanding of the Cold War or the new Cold War, so to speak. So that's my quick comment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think that was certainly the ambition of the organizers. Victor, finally to you.
Well, I have several things to offer to the audience, hoping that they will do it. So let us, as intellectuals, go beyond mundane things. Let us try to be communicative and to think differently and to respect the opinions of others, but not to stick to the definitions and to notions of the gurus of the world. You are the gurus or the future gurus that have to design the world. No one do that for you. Unfortunately, there is a thing that we haven't discussed. We all lived for 500 years or even more in the civilization of Logos, where the printed word was the most important thing that connects human brain with others. Now we are not living in this world any longer. We have shifted to what I call the civilization of screen. When a kid of 1 year old is given this machine and tries to play with it and sees images and sees films on it before he learns the words that describe this small gadget. So that is a problem for the humanity, because film is a ready-made fast food emotional package. So if we want to be intellectually potent, we need to be still connecting the word, the logos, the text, and the images in our heads. We have to produce images inside our brain, but not outside with the artificial intelligence. So that is the global task. How to reach this? For student, communication is most important, as well as for all of us. So be innovative scholars, use book definitions to spring your own originality, and then practice dialoguing. You have to communicate in words, verbally, with others, not with TikTok images, not with these small things. These are entertainment and surrogates. Be serious, at least in the Baptist University. Hope it will be expanded elsewhere. So I'm looking very much forward for the 3 days of student presentations to learn from you guys and to be in tacit dialogue with you. And you can always reach me by email and communicate with me. I would be happy to be dialoguing with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. You may regret that. We will have you back to speak to us. But Victor, I love that. So beyond bipolar, beyond multipolar, we should be thinking of a multi-guru world, right? And so it leads me to thank the 4 gurus that we've had this morning here in Hong Kong. Greg, Arjun, John, and Victor, Thank you on behalf of the audience for getting us off to a great start.